Welcome back to another edition of the Creator Spotlight. Today I have Jeremy Berke from Cultivated Media. How you doing today, Jeremy?
I'm good, Lars. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to do this.
Absolutely. So let's start at the beginning. What originally drew you to journalism, and then how did that lead to your obsession with cannabis?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll try and answer this and be as pithy as possible. I would say if you had asked me when I was 12 what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would have answered journalist. And I think I'm now 32, and that hasn't changed, right? And so I always knew that this was a field I wanted to be in. However, like many journalists, took a very circuitous path to get here. Long story short, I graduated from college in 2014, dating myself. I took a writing job at a small travel publication, which was really fun, a really good learning experience, my first sort of like professional introduction into writing. From there, I got hired at Business Insider, and that was in 2015. So the run up to the 2016 election, I landed on the politics desk, and it was a quick education and learning that I did not want to report about politics, right? For obvious reasons. So at the time, I kind of rotated around a few different desks to try and figure out what my passion was, what I like to cover, what I was good at covering. I ended up on the finance team, and I had really did not know anything about business, anything about finance. Like I didn't know what revenue was, basically like complete blank slate. But I wanted to work on that team because at the time, Business Insider was hiring some really stellar reporters and editors from other publications. So I wanted to learn from them and just soak up as much as I could. When I was on that desk in, I think I want to say late 2016, early 2017, I wrote about a small financing round that a cannabis company had raised, just kind of like a one-off. That got more feedback in my inbox on my social media than like anything I'd written to date previous to my career. And so, I saw that there was, an opportunity for a financial publication like Business Insider to treat this like an industry and not sort of do the kind of, with all due respect, like the High Times kind of headline of like, here's the 10 best bongs, right? So that was number one. And number two is like, I'm pretty open with this. Like I'm a consumer. I always have been. I have been probably too early in my life, and I've been passionate about it. And so I wanted to kind of marry that interest in reporting with an industry that I had a personal stake in a lot of ways. So, what was a one-off story became 30% of my time, became 50% of my time until I, pitched our editor-in-chief and some higher editors on actually launching a vertical. And so, we were the first major financial publication in New York to cover the industry and have dedicated reporters covering it, which I'm very proud of. And, to sort of come full circle, like I'm Canadian originally. I grew up in Toronto. And, Toronto and Canada is still far ahead from where the East Coast is, or was, especially at that time, where the East Coast is on legalization and consumer cannabis markets. And so I had seen the wave coming early. I spotted it early, I think. And, as a reporter in their late 20s, mid to late 20s, like I thought I could try and compete for scoops on Uber and Meta and Facebook with people 15 years older than me, or I could zig where others zag and start reporting on this industry. And I think, I hope that that's paid dividends later.
Yeah. So after launching the cannabis vertical with Business Insider, I believe you got up to like 20,000 some subscribers. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So yeah, I'll kind of answer that question in two parts.
Okay.
So we had a weekly newsletter that was sort of like more free form, but I was in the structure of a mainstream newsroom. It's very, very different than what we're doing now, and so my incentive was to write for paid subscribers. And so each week I had to get scoops, which meant like reporting things that other reporters didn't have, not from press releases. And then the weekly newsletter would be at the end of the week, which is sort of like the curation version of that. And so they had the business side and editorial decently firewalled. So I don't know exactly what type of revenue I was bringing in, but it was, pretty substantial enough for them to dedicate resources to the industry. And then the Insider Cannabis newsletter that we were writing had 20,000 free subscribers by the end of it, before it was sunsetted.
And so what did you learn from building that newsroom presence, obviously inside a pretty major media company? And how has that shaped how you approach building Cultivated?
Yeah, it's a really good question. What did I learn? I learned receptiveness to your audience is pretty much everything. And, now that I'm in the sort of creator world versus the mainstream media world, like it's kind of anathema to journalists to look at and even for, many reasons even care about the business side of things. But that's basically my hyper focus, right? Like I want to basically deliver the audience exactly what they want. Not in terms of like parroting their political viewpoints, but in terms of the types of stories, the coverage, the writing style they want, make sure I'm very receptive to that. And also to know that, like, journalism is a business, media is a business, and, you have to build an audience. Your audience has to like you. And there's a game you have to play with that, right? Like, I can't just write something that I think is brilliant and put it on the internet and expect people to come. Like, you have to build the engine that people come to find you. You have to listen to them. And I think the last thing I'll say on that is like, to have the confidence to, see something through, right? Like when I first started writing about the cannabis industry at Business Insider, it was not something people were comfortable with. I even had editors ask me, "Oh, are you tacitly endorsing the use of an illegal drug? All stoners are despicable people." Like that mentality existed, and I had to kind of like, I had to really kind of fight and push for that and make sure my coverage was, to excuse my language, smart as fuck, because there was an extra degree of scrutiny on everything I wrote because of the subject matter it was. And I still hold that today. Like, I just think we have to go to the nth degree to make sure that what we're doing is serious, because the subject matter stigmas die hard, and the subject matter can still turn people's noses up outside of the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were talking about this offline, but you eventually left Business Insider. You were planning on pursuing your MBA, but ultimately you connected with Jay and launched Cultivated while also getting your MBA at Columbia. So, one, what made you want to build something independent, ultimately with Cultivated, and then how has the last few years of business school influenced the way you think about media, cannabis, and building?
Yeah, no, I love the question. Prior to business school, I think I had, I had a good faculty with the language of business, because I'd reported on banking, I'd reported on Wall Street. And so I could speak the language, but I didn't really have the intuitive understanding of like how a balance sheet and income statement fit together, why businesses make certain decisions, the type of communications that leaders and executives do, how the stock market works on a much more fundamental level. And so I think in terms of my journalism, like I can relate a lot better to business leaders having gone through a very, similar education. Like frankly, many of them have MBAs and, sat in the same class as I did. And so there is that shared understanding. Two, I think it's not all the time, I'm not perfect about this, but it's taken my head out of like, how can I just write the best story every single day, to like, I want to build a business, right? And sometimes those two pieces come into conflict with each other, right? Because I cover the industry that we take partnership money from, right? And that is certainly, certainly could pose conflicts, but it definitely, I definitely think about things like customer acquisition, the lifetime value of a customer, like how are we building a flywheel, like stuff that I just had no idea prior to business school. And I think it really works. Like I think, without it, like I don't think Cultivated would be in the same spot as in today. I mean, I can't say that, I have no counterfactual, but like I think it's really helped us pour rocket fuel on what we're building.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's another topic that I battle with is barely sharing news and reviews on the various brands in the hemp beverage space, but I also want to take money from them from an advertising perspective in a lot of ways. Have you had any conflicts when accepting advertising money and maybe a story arose and reporting on the story in a fair way for an advertiser?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, yes. I'll keep sort of like names and stuff out of this.
Mm.
You know, I think at the end of the day, and I hope people in the industry listen to this. Like a lot of people want to pay for and read aggressive reporting about their competitors. They never want to read it about themselves, right? And for the ecosystem to be fair, everyone has to get the same level of scrutiny. That's my firm belief as not only as a journalist, but as an operator of a media business, right? I understand that. Not everyone does. And I like to work with people because I have a network in the space that we know, that we like, that I know will be fair. It doesn't mean that everything we write makes everyone happy all the time. They're just aware that it's going to be fair. We're going to give people opportunity to comment. And look, like, if you lose a partner here or there over that, I think that's okay. But I think fairness and treating people like humans and fairly goes a very, very long way towards that. At the end of the day, though, like, this has really been a conflict that any B2B media company has had for decades, right?
Yeah.
There isn't always a playbook to deal with it. And again, like, these aren't legal issues. Like, it's not like, like a freedom of speech violation. It's just the sort of the messier middle of where humans and markets interact. And so, yeah, I think there's no easy answer to that question, but it's something that we fumble around and we hope to strike the right balance. Last thing I'll say on that is that, like, look, like, Cultivated is really like a 2, sometimes 3-man team when we have people helping us write the newsletters. And, we're not ProPublica, right? Like, we are not doing deep dive investigations into labor practices companies. Like, we're an industry publication, right? And so at the end of the day, like, I think our reporting, while eventually I'd like it to be heavy hitting, at this stage, it is not. And that's something people understand too. Like, we're sort of more morning brew than ProPublica. And that gives us a little bit of an easier position to monetize through partnerships and sponsorships.
So Cultivated has become one of the go-to newsletters and publications for policy and business pros alike. What do you think makes your approach to cannabis industry and news different from other publications out there?
Yeah, I think it's kind of what we talked about earlier. Our approach is really, really to be audience first. I have no ego about my own writing. I think I'm good. I don't think I'm, a Pulitzer Prize winning, New Yorker writer. And so, like, what I care about is delivering information very quickly to busy professionals, right? And I think being receptive to that was honestly pretty hard for me, because as a journalist, you're trained to, like, long form is everything. Your prose has to be so good. And, like, it's like, okay, like, what if we just stopped caring about that and said, hey, like, if you work at a cannabis company and you're reading your email for 5 minutes at 7:30 in the morning, like, what do you need to know? So I think that's number one. I think two, like, our daily format becoming a habit for people rather than waiting till we have something to write, I think is really important. And I think three, like, unfortunately, cannabis media is drying up. Like, there are very few publications left, and there is an element of, like, not last man standing, but there's only a few places for people to look, and hopefully we are the first or at the very near top of those places to look.
Are there any stories in the industry that you think industry as a whole tends to either overhype or underreport?
So many. I think one is, like, U.S. federal reform. It's, if you go on social media, especially among the retail investor crowd, like, it's everything they're looking at. And people have certain beliefs on either side of the political spectrum about federal reform that completely correlates to how people voted in November, right? And so it's like the definition of motivated reasoning. It's not something I pay a lot of attention to. Like, I mean, not that I don't pay attention to federal reform. I just don't pay attention to people's opinions about it, right? And I think this week we're hearing from executives at all the biggest multi-state operators, CEOs, CFOs, talk about their business, and outside of a few of them, like, federal reform isn't the primary thing they're thinking about. They're thinking about their balance sheet. They're thinking about what new markets to be in. It's a bit of an aside, and so when it happens, it'll be nice. But right now, it doesn't seem to be happening under this administration, and so we have to move on. I think underreported stories. Yeah, I think we frankly get a lot of people talking about labor issues at big cannabis companies. Some very legitimate gripes about working conditions, about unionization efforts. Some not so much, right? And so parsing through that is very difficult. And I would love to have the time and the space to kind of report those stories in a way that makes sense. But that's certainly something that I hear from sources all the time that I think I just don't see bubble up into the press in other ways. Yeah, I think it's probably the best way I can answer the question, but more in my head too. Yeah.
Fair enough. We were also talking about this a little bit offline. You and Jay have expanded beyond the newsletter. You have a focus on live streams. I'm not sure if you're actually doing a full-blown podcast, but you're definitely doing the live streams. You mentioned possibly doing an event next year. What's next for you guys? How are you thinking about media growth in this niche, and then overall just as
Yeah, so I mean, all due credit to Jay for sort of training my thinking on that. I mean, I think, for me, my goals without Jay would primarily be like, how do I deliver my writing to the biggest audience possible? Jay has been the one to sort of think about the newsletter as a top of funnel, right? And to have a real platform media business behind it. And so, we engage our audience in different ways. We have daily live streams, and those travel, pretty far. Like, we can sort of cut it up. We release the audio. So it's a pseudo podcast. It goes on YouTube, it gets cut up into shorts, it travels on LinkedIn. And so we're trying to sort of move out of like the 750 word news story is the atomic unit of media, and think about how do we engage our audience in different ways, like whether it's listening, reading, watching. How are they thinking about this? How can we deliver the stories to them? How can we bite things out in those ways? I think I can say this. I'll keep the rest of the details under wraps. We have a big event that we're planning in New York in April. There are a lot of cannabis conferences. There are a few good ones. And so, we want to be sure to make it smaller and cultivate, I can use that word, the room with the right people, decision makers in the industry. And that's our goal there. And so, we're totally bootstrapped. We haven't raised any money. We don't plan to in the near future, although never say never. But we really are trying to figure out, like, how do we keep the business very low overhead and get the most content out as possible? And that, somewhere there's alchemy that will, help us grow and maybe someday have a multi-million-dollar exit. We'll see.
That would be great. So, Who is someone, whether it be in cannabis or media as a whole, that you admire right now?
Yeah, I would answer the question. It's a really good question. There are a lot of. I'll answer the question like this. Like I look outside of cannabis. Like I sort of I find my business to be the media business more than it's the cannabis business.
Mm-hmm.
And so I look at a lot of different publications that seem to be exactly what I want Cultivated to be. And so I'll answer it less of a question of who I admire, but what I admire. So, the logic is a Canadian business and technology newsroom, mostly monetized through subscriptions and events. And they do really, really good, incisive reporting on Canada's business and tech sector without being like a kind of anti-capitalist publication, which I think many journalists and reporters are, frankly, and I'm not. And so I think the logic is really good. The information is another publication that I really, really admire. I think what Jess Lesson has built is awesome. They do some of the best reporting. They get the best scoops. At the same time, they still walk the needle of uplifting the industry they cover and rooting out malfeasance in a way that's good for everyone. And I think, it's sort of like trite to say, but obviously the Morning Brew is like a huge inspiration for us. Obviously an inspiration to any new media newsletter business. But I think what those guys have built has been awesome. They brought like fun and levity into financial news, and that's something we try and do. And it's my personality. Like I like to write with a little bit of humor and snark, and it's inspired by them. Being audience first, but delivering the information they need, and the playbook they've built for building a media business. I really, really admire what they built.
Likewise. So final question here: how can the Herbal Profiles community support you and what you're building at Cultivated?
Yeah, I mean, look, like we would love more readers, right? Like, so we are in growth stage, and it's a simple question. Like, if you're in the industry, whether you are a bud tender, whether you are a lawyer, whether you are the CEO of a cannabis company, like, we want you reading us. So the more readers we can get, the more places readers can find us, the better it is for us. So we welcome anyone and everyone, whether or not you love every newsletter or hate it. Like, let's have a conversation. That's our biggest goal.
Love it. And I'll put a link in the article as well. So thank you very much, Jeremy. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Until next time, guys. Cheers.
Thanks, Lars.